This is DW News live from Berlin. Tonight, the top Democrat in the U.S. Senate calls for a political change in Israel.
This critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel.
Chuck Schumer taking aim at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, calling him an obstacle to peace. Also coming up, getting food to the people in Gaza. Workers are building a floating pier to allow aid ships to dock. Israel is accused of allegedly blocking food deliveries by land. Plus,
we impose red lines to ourselves. These are self-imposed red lines, but Putin does not have any red lines.
A warning from Lithuania's prime minister to Germany: do not take any options off the table when it comes to helping Ukraine fight against Russia. And 3 times not the charm for SpaceX's Starship, the most powerful rocket ever built, did not survive its test flight today, making it 0 for 3 in the race to return to the moon. I'm Brent Goff. To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin tonight in the United States with tough talk on Israel from the top Democrat in the U.S. Senate, who also happens to be the highest-ranking Jewish lawmaker in the country. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer today called for new elections in Israel, and he criticized Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, calling him an obstacle to peace. Take a listen.
5 months into this conflict, it is clear that Israelis need to take stock of the situation and ask, must we change course? At this critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel. At a time when so many Israelis have lost their confidence in the vision and direction of their government.
Let's go to Washington now. Our correspondent Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, he's been following this story for us. Benjamin, the comments from Schumer, shocking to some people, very controversial for others. Talk to me about the importance of what he said today.
It is important indeed. It is the highest ranking official in the U.S., Jewish ranking official here in the United States. And for him to have such clear words on the Netanyahu government and also that Israel is taking the wrong path, of course, puts a lot of pressure also on the Biden administration, with many accusing Joe Biden, the president of the U.S., of not being tough on Israel, on not having red lines. And that's also is something that we see now with a renewed criticism over the humiliation, how many call it, that the U.S. needs to airdrop aid into Gaza without putting enough pressure on Israel to let the trucks with aid actually enter Gaza now.
The United States, we learned today, have sanctioned 3 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and their outposts. What more do we know about that?
That's right. It's not the first time that the U.S. is sanctioning settlers. That's something that also happened in February. What they announced today by the U.S. Treasury was sanctions on 2 illegal Israeli outposts, and also that have been accused of undermining stability in the West Bank, and also on some settlers. That's something that also happened in February. So we have these 2 news coming up from the U.S. today. On one side, that new sanctions have been announced. On others, this comments also, and ask about that, if the White House was actually informed about the comments of Chuck Schumer. National Security spokesperson John Kirby said that he gave advance notice to the White House but did not ask for approval or disappointment in the State Department, once again saying that those are Schumer's comments and not the ones of the Biden administration. But we can expect that these comments will put more pressure on the Biden administration.
And the news today, what does it mean for the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which we know is not a perfect one at the moment?
That's right. The relations are very strained right now, not just from the comments that we hear from Washington, but also from the comments that we hear from Israel that criticized that Chuck Schumer said earlier today. There are renewed calls for the U.S. to put real red lines on Israel and to not keep exporting more weapons. And that's also what many said regarding this comments by Chuck Schumer, who also said that the weapons export need to be conditioned to Israel, as the U.S. does with any other ally. around the world. So we can expect that the discussion will continue, as some praised the words from Schumer and other criticized it, saying that it's not up to the US or a member of Senate to actually tell the Israeli people when they should have new elections.
All right, DW Washington correspondent Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber. Benjamin, we will be talking with you later in the day as our coverage of the reaction to Schumer's comments continues a little bit later. Thank you. Well, staying in the Middle East, the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says at least 6 Palestinians were killed and dozens more wounded after Israeli troops opened fire on crowds waiting for humanitarian aid trucks in Gaza City. Israel's military has not commented yet on the alleged incident. Israel is coming under increasing international pressure to allow more aid into Gaza. The construction of a small offloading pier is now underway, and a ship carrying 200 tons of food is slowly making its way from Cyprus towards the besieged territory. Aid agencies are warning, however, that airdrops and the maritime corridor are no alternatives to deliveries by land. Well, Israeli Army spokesman Elad Goren today said that humanitarian aid agencies are responsible for the problems with aid deliveries to Gaza.
Often, there is hundreds of trucks worth of aid waiting on the Gazan side to be picked up. That is the biggest obstacle to aid reaching Gaza in need. The international organization do not have the capacity and have yet to take real steps to improve that capacity to distribute the humanitarian aid through the Gaza Strip, including the north. The issue is not with our inspection, but with the distribution capabilities of the international organizations.
Well, not everyone sees it that way. Earlier, I asked the UN aid coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory, Jamie McGoldrick, to discuss these claims by Israel, and I asked him, are they true?
No, it's not true. I mean, we have 200 trucks come in a day. We get them from Israel's side, and it's not enough. Before the crisis and the war started on the 7th of October, there was 500 or 600 trucks coming in a day. And since that time, people have had a massive, catastrophic humanitarian disaster upon them. And we just don't have the numbers of trucks that come in, regardless of what Israel, in terms of processes, their maximum, which is 250 at any given day. So if we got all of that in every day, it's still so much of a gap in terms of what we really need for the population. So we need more entry points, one in the north, and we need other places for food to come into, rather than just the one crossing point at the moment. And until we change that, we're always going to be unable to address the full complement of needs of people there: food, medical, health, as well as water, sanitation and shelter. These are the life-saving issues that are under real strain at the moment because of the lack of supplies.
And what has to happen for humanitarian aid to be safely transported into the Gaza Strip and to get to the people? I mean, even today we saw Israeli troops taking aim and killing people in the territory. I mean, there's no indication that that's going to subside anytime soon.
No, I think that there's a lot of desperation there, that people haven't received regular food for a long time. And the convoys of food that come through are often challenged by these crowds and ransacked because they're desperate and their families are desperate. And until we get a massive supply of food into the north and into the south, and we flood the place with food, the desperation will not disappear. So it's so important for us to get as many trucks in every day possible, day in, day out. And if we don't get that, then there's always going to be that insecurity, there's going to be that instability. And therefore, you know, when troops are in that sort of situation, anything can happen. We've seen many times the cases where people have been shot and wounded in different situations as they wait for food. And we have to find a way of getting them to be less desperate. And that means opening up as many places as possible in order for enough aid to get in, both from the air and from the maritime corridors which are opening up. But these are not the answers. These are not alternatives to road transport. These are just an addition to it. For example, the boat that's coming in later this week, coming on the maritime corridor, there's only 20 trucks worth on board there, and we can put 30, 40 trucks in a day, regular day, using the roads.
Jamie McGoldrick, UN aid coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory. Jamie, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, here's a look now at some of the other stories that are making headlines around the world. Spanish lawmakers have approved a bill granting amnesty to those involved in Catalonia's 2017 independence bid. The amnesty was a condition made by separatist parties in exchange for supporting Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez after last year's inconclusive election results. The European Parliament has decided to take the European Commission to court over a decision to give billions of euros to Hungary. Now, the Commission, which is effectively the EU government, unblocked funds for Hungary back in December despite opposition from Parliament. The dispute between two of the highest EU institutions will be heard before the European Court of Justice. Here in Germany, almost 600 flights were canceled today after security staff at several airports went on strike to demand better pay. 90,000 passengers were affected. Staff at a further 5 German airports are set to strike on Friday. Well, there will be no German cruise missiles headed to Ukraine. Today, German lawmakers stood with their chancellor and voted against sending tourist cruise missiles to Kyiv. But the debate here in Berlin over the long-range missiles, it's intensifying divisions within Germany's government. Some in the government and the opposition are demanding that Germany deliver the tourist missiles to Kyiv. Chancellor Scholz and his Social Democrats are against that idea, citing the risk of Germany being dragged into the war. Well, today in Parliament, a senior opposition lawmaker accused the chancellor of playing into Vladimir Putin's hands.
Your supposed prudence has only fueled Mr. Putin's aggression against Ukraine. That is the result. Isn't it time we not only talked about how to wage war, but also about how to freeze this conflict and stop it?
Earlier, I asked our political correspondent Simon Young, who's been following this debate for us, why is the German government so hesitant about sending these tourist missiles to Ukraine?
Yeah, Brent, I think when we talk about the German government in this context, we really should focus on the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, because he's the one who's really driving this position, this blockade against sending the tourist cruise missiles. He doesn't want to do anything, as you already said, that could seem to drag Germany into the war as a direct participant. And there's a fear that that could happen, for instance, if the Ukrainians pointed the tourists at Russian territory and caused damage there. The Russians might interpret that as an act of aggression sort of indirectly by Germany. It could also be a problem if sending tourists in some way meant that there also needed to be German soldiers on the ground to assist with the targeting. So that's one side of it. The other thing is political. I think Olaf Scholz is looking at polling, realizing that a majority of Germans don't want to send tourists, but they, more importantly, want to bring an end to the fighting as soon as possible. So Olaf Scholz positioning himself as a sort of guarantor of peace, a peace chancellor, as some have said. And I think, all of that is feeding into his thinking.
And Simon, there isn't any real unanimity within the government when it comes to not sending these cruise missiles to Ukraine. And we've seen the opposition, the Conservatives, they've been trying to make political capital out of this. Are they still going to be able to do that, or is this debate now over?
Well, these debates about tourists in the Bundestag might be over for now, but I don't think the wider debate will be. I mean, the opposition here sort of sensed an opportunity because they can see that there's division within the government. Some of the smaller parties, the two smaller parties, a little bit more in favour, generally speaking, of sending tourists than Olaf Scholz and his Social Democrats. But in fact, there's division on the CDU side as well. So maybe they'll hold off from these debates. But I think you've got ideas like some sort of swap with the British so that they would send their missiles to replace for tourists and other things. The Ukrainians are calling for more assistance. Olaf Scholz says he wants to deliver that. The only question is how.
DW's political correspondent Simon Young. Simon, thank you. The Lithuanian Prime Minister, Ingrida Šimonytė, was here in Berlin today for talks with the German Chancellor. The two leaders discussed security and defense. Lithuania has been one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion began 2 years ago. The Baltic state says it supports the debate that's taking place right now about whether or not to send Western troops to Ukraine. Germany has agreed to station 5,000 troops permanently in Lithuania as part of NATO defense measures. Well, earlier today, the Prime Minister of Lithuania spoke with us here at DW News, and we asked her, did she urge German Chancellor Scholz to send those Taurus missiles to Ukraine?
Well, I think this is a very focused debate on one particular sort of weapons. And we've seen, as it was mentioned, quite similar debates about other sorts of weapons in the past. So I do not think I want really very much to comment on that. I do hear what Chancellor is saying, but my point is that I think our problem is that we are very predictable to Russia and Putin because we constantly say him what we are not going to do. And we impose red lines to ourselves. These are self-imposed red lines, but Putin does not have any red lines. And when we speak about not doing something because of fear of escalation, so let's look at the other side, because the other side constantly blah-blah-blahing about, for example, nuclear weapons and similar things is absolutely reckless and absolutely not in a position to sort of value this self-restrainment of Ukrainian supporters, of countries supporting Ukraine. So, of course, this is for the German government to decide. But I think this is the biggest problem of the Western allies of Ukraine, that we constantly sort of put ourselves in a situation where we deny that we will do something to support Ukraine, rather than saying that we must do whatever it takes for Ukraine to win this war.
Was Lithuania's Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė speaking with us earlier today. But there are almost 240,000 Russian citizens living here in Germany, and that number jumped when Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022. Many Russian expats will be able to vote in Russia's presidential election, which starts on Friday. Well, we spoke to some members of the Russian diaspora here in Berlin to find out their hopes and fears for the future of their home country.
Notionally, this gilded fortress is where Berlin's Russians would come to cast their votes in Sunday's elections. These days, they mostly come to mourn. Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Putin's fiercest critic, was found dead in a penal colony last month. Another brutal nail in the coffin of democracy. Try as they might, some are still hoping to keep the flame alive. Around the back of the embassy, Putin's opponents are channeling their anger. Freedom for political prisoners, they shout. The campaign to rename this street Alexei Navalny Strasse has gained almost 50,000 signatures.
I was a Navalny supporter, and I think that the fight is not over. And this today is a part of the fight against Putin's propaganda.
A space for artists nearby. Dozens of Russians packed into a cosy theatre in search of inspiration, hope or therapy. On stage, a discussion about the upcoming vote, about war and about what to do next.
I don't expect any good from this election.
Are you going to vote?
No.
Why not?
I don't know what Navalny would say. He would probably call to do something. But I don't know if I should go to the Russian embassy.
I will vote.
Who will you vote for?
I guess I will destroy the ballot. Probably I will just vote for more than one candidate. And maybe I will write, our president is Navalny.
I think most of the people who came to Germany, to Europe, do not have much expectations from these elections, because it's very clear what the outcome is going to be.
Amid that feeling of helplessness, a sense of guilt prevails over Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine.
No matter where you live, in the West or in Russia, you feel responsibility for this.
Back at the demonstration, nerves are on edge. Everyone here knows all too well how Putin has deployed the vast state apparatus to keep control and crush dissent.
Just a minute ago, actually, a consulate person has spoken to me, just said hi, meaning that he's been observing us, he's been present at this action, and has been registering everything that is happening here.
It's really bad. I'm afraid to go back to Russia, my homeland. Who could think that?
Perhaps this man, a political exile who tells me he was imprisoned in Russia for fighting corruption.
We have only one choice for stop Putinism is army, is Ukraine army. And when Ukraine win in Ukraine territory, Putin is Russian people. Don't believe Putin. What is Putinism is good.
With the battlefield out of the question and electoral change a diminishing prospect, all that is left for those here are small acts of courage and expressions of defiance in hope for a better future.
Well, joining me here in the studio now is my colleague, Roman Goncharenko. He's a DW political editor. He's an expert on Eastern Europe. Roman, it's good to see you. We just saw right there's quite a large Russian diaspora here in Germany, but when we talk about them, we can't talk about them as being a monolith of Russian opposition, can we?
Of course not. So we see a lot of Russian opposition here because many came after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, after 22, but not so many. So we are talking about maybe tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands like Ukrainian refugees here in Germany. Mm-hmm. But there were already hundreds of thousands people living in Germany who speak Russian. Not all of them have Russian passports, mm-hmm. but we can assume that there are Putin supporters among them. Mm-hmm. They've shown Russian flags in support for this war. There were rallies in cities like Berlin or Cologne, but we don't know if those were only Russian citizens. Some of them were German citizens as well. So it's a complicated picture. But I think what's interesting to watch will be on Sunday, the Russian opposition has called its citizens to show up at midday mm-hmm. And to show solidarity. It's called Midday Against Putin. Mm-hmm. And some opposition leaders think that it's a good idea to show up and just to see how many people are against this war and against Putin. Mm-hmm. So I guess it will be easier for people here in Germany to show up. This is probably the only legal way where you can show that you're against Putin and against this election, against the war in Russia. Just turning up at an election.
The optics are not good for Vladimir Putin, that's for sure, but the number of votes outside of Russia, they really can't make a difference in the outcome of the election, can they? Even if the election were a fair and free election.
Well, not really. So there is absolutely no ground to believe that the election outside of Russia will be fairer mm-hmm. than inside Russia. So in Germany last time, there were just about 30,000, I think, people who voted here in Germany. This time it could be higher, but we do not know. The mm-hmm. Russian opposition is still divided on the issue mm-hmm. if you should vote or not. Some say, don't go there, don't do this, just show up, show solidarity and go away. Others say, come and vote. Maybe you can vote for anyone but Putin, just like the video of Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who was presumably killed, or at least we don't know exactly at the moment, but this is what some people think, that he was killed a few weeks before the election day.
Okay.
And this is what makes this election special. This is the first presidential election without Alexei Navalny.
Yeah, and it is also the first presidential election with a war in Ukraine that you're not allowed to call a war in Russia.
Absolutely.
Roman Goncharenko. Roman, we appreciate your reporting and your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the world's most powerful rocket ever built, SpaceX's Starship, blasted off Thursday, but it did not make it back to Earth intact. The one-hour test flight began in Texas and headed out over the Gulf of Mexico. No crew or satellites were on board. SpaceX owner Elon Musk called today's flight a success, saying thousands of improvements have been made since test flights began last year. So far, all 3 of those test flights have had a fiery ending. So what happened? Earlier, we spoke to Keith Cowing, a space expert and the editor of NASA Watch in Washington, D.C.
Well, they usually get signals back from a spacecraft as it comes back to Earth. And as it does, there's a lot of heat, the atmosphere churns up, and you usually lose radio contact. But we were seeing, some really amazing video, but then they lost the signals to 2 different types of satellites at the same time and heard nothing since. So it's not unusual to expect that something would be lost in reentry. But again, they've already accomplished everything they wanted to do just by getting it up into space. So, you win a few, you lose a few, but third time is the charm. When you set the parameters of a test, you say we want to launch the rocket, we want the first stage to work, separate from the second stage, that goes into orbit, a door opens, do some tests, it does all the stuff in space, and then it begins to re-enter. Everything I said worked up until that point. That was really what they are attempting to do. They didn't expect to recover the first stage or the second stage. In fact, they were just going to crash them. That wasn't part of the test. So if you look at it from that perspective, it's a complete success. Ideally, and they'll tell you, we'd like to get our rockets back because we want to reuse them.
That was space expert Keith Cowing speaking with us earlier from Washington, D.C. And finally, a homecoming of sorts on Hudson River in New York City today. The iconic British Airways Concorde jet returned to the Intrepid Museum at Pier 86 in Manhattan. The supersonic jet was removed by crane from its place in August to undergo months of restoration at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The Concorde was once the fastest commercial aircraft in the world. Here's a reminder of our top story. U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has called for Israel to hold new elections, and he's condemned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In a speech to the Senate, Schumer called the Israeli Prime Minister a major obstacle to peace. You're watching DW News. The day is next.